is the DeFi Decoded podcast by Ninepoint Partners in cooperation with Prophecy DeFi. The ideas and opinions expressed in this podcast should not be taken as investment advice. Always consult with your financial advisor before investing.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of DeFi Decoded. I'm Alex Tapscott here with my co-host Andrew Young. We've launched a new series where we're talking to some special guests. We are going to have to wait a week to share our interview that we recorded this week because there's some big news which we thought was topical and deserves some attention, which is that yesterday Facebook crashed for 10 perilous hours or blissful hours, depending on your perspective. Facebook and all the Facebook branded apps basically went offline, which maybe provided a bit of respite to some people, but really what it did was exposed the centralized and surprisingly fragile nature of the internet and our reliance ultimately on very large centralized institutions and companies. So a little bit of background here. Despite the broadly positive innovations of the internet, we still basically have relied on middlemen to perform many of the essential functions, such as maintaining key infrastructure, moving and storing value and assets and data online, verifying identities, performing basic business logic like databasing, contracting, and so forth. And that's the way the internet's kind of worked. And it's worked okay, but it's problematic for several reasons, right? First of all, these big centralized institutions are vulnerable clearly to hacking or to failure. Now, in the case of Facebook, they said there was no malicious intent here, which is almost scarier. It just sort of stopped working. Banks, social media companies, and other intermediaries are also gatekeepers that exclude many people. And they also capture basically all the data and much of the value that's created online. And that's bad for a couple of reasons. It can violate our privacy, but it also means we don't actually get to participate economically in the value that we create by being participants in networks like Facebook and others. So blockchain promises a new era of the internet that's dubbed Web3, which could potentially solve many of these problems by giving us a way to move and store assets digitally and peer-to-peer. But not only that, it gives us the tools and the incentives and the mechanisms to create value and to organize capability in decentralized networks, or DAOs, which stands for distributed autonomous organizations, rather than these centralized companies. Web3 also promises, a fairer, more resilient, and more transparent, more private and more decentralized internet, financial industry, and economy. So that all sounds well and good. But in this episode, we're going to dig into it and do a quick little reality check on Web3. Can it actually solve these problems? Is it really ready for prime time? Or does it threaten to create a system that's just as fragile, but more fragmented and thus harder to corral and to control? So that's the topic for this week's edition. We figured it's not often that $1 trillion company just turns off the lights and stops working for a day. So let's dig into what this means for the future. So Andrew, Web3 is a buzzword that is going around a lot. It's the nom de jour or day or week or whatever you want to call it. Well, how do you think about Web3 in the context of the internet's evolution?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think that a lot of the confusion around Web3 comes from the fact that a lot of people don't even really know what kind of Web 1 and Web 2 are, unless you're sort of in the more technology circles and sort of pay attention to this type of stuff. So it's probably better to start there. So the internet, when it was first kind of created, which we now call Web 1, the websites that you could access were essentially read-only. So what I mean by that is the websites were not very dynamic. They're very static in nature. They presented information to users, but it was very much a read-only web. So what I mean by that is, I guess it's kind of self-explanatory. You can only really kind of intake information from these websites. Then the Web 2, the next kind of the big leap up from Web 1 was kind of started in kind of the mid to late 1990s and then really started to kind of explode with the social networks, was this read and write web, Web 2. And what that essentially means is rather than just intaking information, users can now actually contribute information to websites, which would then be sort of other users could read and other users could write into it. And that's essentially just social networking. And that's kind of, obviously Web 2 is pretty big. The largest companies in the world are all kind of built off the Web 2 sort of websites, obviously Facebook, and you can kind of even classify things like Google and other platforms into that. And then what was interesting though, and we can talk a little bit about this later, there's a lot of issues with Web 2. For the most part, these are trillion-dollar companies that essentially consume all of our data, and we effectively are the product for these platforms. And there's a lot of issues with that. They're also they're built on more fragile infrastructure, more centralized infrastructure. And so that's kind of given birth to this emerging Web3 narrative, which came into the existence when Bitcoin came onto the scene, because people realized that we could actually have an internet that we could read, write, and own. So blockchain provides that third element, the ability to actually own these websites that so much of international commerce is based on nowadays. And that's essentially what Web3 is. It allows users to build, essentially allows users to access websites that are distributed, decentralized, immutable, and secure. And also, most importantly, you get to actually have the opportunity to own a piece of this internet, which is a totally different business model from Web 2 and sort of the trillion-dollar companies that we have today.
So let's talk about like an obvious Web 2 company, Facebook, which went down on Monday. So, okay, I use Facebook, and you can complain about parts of it. It's bad for political discourse. It makes us dumber, etc. But I think the main criticism that's sort of lobbed at it is that it's bad for our privacy, right? That all this data that we share gets repackaged and repurposed and used to sell products to us. So we become the product as you described it. But we've known about that for a while, and it seems like there are probably some people who choose not to engage on these platforms for that reason. But by and large, most people kind of seem to like the convenience and the features of a Facebook. So my thinking around Web3 is always, it's true that some people will care about a more decentralized, private web where I can have my own sovereign identity and move around freely. But I think ultimately it's all about utility and usefulness, right? And I think what's been really interesting about this podcast series is we've talked about DeFi, which really is Web3 for financial services, depending on how broadly you want to define what Web3 is. It's the idea of creating a decentralized financial services industry. But what's really cool about DeFi is it's not just that you don't have to deal with a bank. It's that you can actually access a wider range of assets. You can access a wider range of services. There's no geographical confines. You're sort of free to have fun and do lots of stuff, right? And so it's really not about some principled argument against banks, though I think that factors into it. It's also just this is better. It's just more fun. It's more interesting. There's better stuff out there. So are we seeing that yet in some of these decentralized alternatives to these large Web 2 companies?
Yeah, it's a great question. We're not really there yet. So Web 3, at least compared to things like NFTs and DeFi, is sort of further away from hitting the mainstream, even though to most people it actually seems like a very obvious sort of shift, given kind of how much negative sentiment there is nowadays regarding Facebook and kind of these tech giants. I was looking at, if you look at kind of polls of, for example, US consumer sentiment of big tech, so that includes Facebook, Google, and among others, it's radically shifted negative to the negative side over the last kind of 5 to 10 years. But with that being said, there's still not really been that much obvious utility to sort of these Web3 projects. I think that's actually starting to shift though with a couple of factors. So the first is censorship is becoming a bigger and bigger issue for Web2 platforms. For the most part at the moment, it's kind of hitting the political right more than any other group. So that seems to be kind of an obvious sort of first target market for some of these Web3 platforms. They're obviously completely censorship resistant. But I think that the second thing that's even more exciting, because that's kind of more of like a principle-based argument, is this ownership economy.
Yeah.
And so to me, one of the things that's really spiked the growth rate of DeFi for the last 18 months was all of these liquidity mining programs that got implemented, where essentially users earned tokens in the DeFi platforms for using them. And the reason why that's so key is that it's an immediate utility to users. If I use a crypto platform, I can essentially just generate higher returns and higher yields, effective yields, than if I use a sort of traditional finance platform. And so right away, that creates a huge incentive for me to use them.
Yeah.
And I think the same thing is going to happen with Web3, where people are going to shift to Web3 platforms because economically it makes a ton of sense to use a social media platform or whatnot that actually essentially pays you to use them.
Exactly.
And I'll just kind of give one last example, because Web3 was actually one of the first narratives that got me really, really excited about crypto kind of 4.5 years ago. And it's sort of interesting because it hasn't really hit the mainstream yet. But the good example is this thing called basic attention token, which is created by the founder of JavaScript and also the Mozilla Firefox browser. So it's got some really big names behind it. And what was interesting about basic attention token was that it was essentially an internet browser that blocked ads as you use the browser. And you could essentially turn on the ability to see ads, and in return, you were paid basic attention tokens. So essentially what it was doing was kind of inverting Google's business model, in the sense that rather than your user data being sold to these kind of third-party advertisers, now you were actually being paid that Google's margin directly in the form of this sort of basic attention token. And so I think that's a very interesting sort of model, and there's obviously lots of flaws in sort of these early stage designs with them, but this idea of kind of being paid to use the internet or being paid for your data is, I think, a narrative that's going to be really, really sort of attractive to people moving forward.
Yeah, I think that was one of the main criticisms of the ICO craze, was that a lot of the projects intended for the token to have utility and to confer some sort of like economic benefit. And in the end, at the time, people were just sort of speculating in them. But that wasn't actually a problem with the Web3 model. The problem was that they were not ready for prime time. I mean, they were mostly, tokens that were built on Ethereum, even though they were someday intended to run on their own, and they have pretty limited utility, right? And today, I think we're at that interesting inflection point where, some of these Web3 apps and concepts are actually starting to see broad and widespread use. I think of DAOs as an example of how we can do things differently than how companies function, right? The idea that you as an early stage user can earn tokens in something new, which gives you some economic benefit and also some say over the future of that thing. And as that thing grows, so too do your holdings, and your clout might also increase as well. And so in a way, it creates, like, as you described, this really powerful economic incentive. And, people, I'd say the leading thinker on Web3 today is Chris Dixon at Andreessen Horowitz. He's a serial entrepreneur and now a very successful venture capitalist. And he sort of describes the model for Web2, which is that, it's all about network effects. And the bigger you get, the more valuable you become. Every new user makes you even more valuable, right? It's positive sum sort of thing, infinite loop. But the problem is that it takes a lot of money to launch a network in the Web2 model. You've got to raise a ton of dough from VCs. You've got to pay for sales and marketing. And in the end, it's the model that benefits monopolies, because once you become entrenched as the big player in your area, it's almost impossible to unseat you. But if you have a model where the individual user gets to participate in value creation, which is important because in early stage of any business or any network, sometimes the product or the service is actually not that useful. So really the economic upside is the most important thing. All of a sudden, like you're a token holder in a new social network or a new, DeFi protocol or a new whatever, and you've got a powerful incentive to continue to use it, continue to hold that token, right? So I love that idea of like new models, which by the way, if you're a VC or, investment banker, you'd be quaking in your loafers thinking about the idea of companies and projects bootstrapping themselves from the ground up like this, because it really undermines the whole notion of capital formation, which is normally key to growing a business. Do you know what I mean? So again, like there's a lot of interesting connections to finance here, even if it's sort of tangential.
Yeah, 100%. I think and especially because exactly like you said, the way that these projects bootstrap themselves is by giving is going straight from the community. It's almost like a direct to community approach. And the idea is like making your community members essentially owners of the platform. You drive these massive network effects right from day one without the need for with a lesser need for the expensive sort of VC capital to fund the growth. I'm curious though, Alex, what are some of the projects in the space that you've been looking at, and what kind of interests you most about the different sort of tech stacks within it?
Yeah, what always interested me is the idea that this can be extended to other industries beyond financial services. I mean, obviously, like I think anybody who's listened to this podcast knows what a fan I am of Bitcoin and of DeFi and digital assets. But there's all these other things where maybe if we created a decentralized network to try and replicate what these companies do, we could do it better, or we could do it in a way that is more resilient. So Filecoin, I think, is an interesting example. Filecoin's not a DAO per se. It's a protocol. It's the token that helps to run the interplanetary file sharing system, IPFS, a little dyslexic. And basically the idea is that, you can contribute your computing power to the network. Instead of staking tokens, you're basically staking storage with some of the token as well. And that storage has to meet minimum requirements, and as a result becomes part of a decentralized storage network and computing network, which could compete with, say, like an Amazon Web Services, for example. Now, you might ask yourself, well, aren't there economies of scale and benefits to centralization when it comes to buying computing power? And I think that's probably true, but there are also lots of other benefits to decentralization. So in Turkey, for example, in any autocratic system where the person in power can shut things down. They tried to shut down Wikipedia in Turkey, and now Wikipedia runs on Filecoin, on IPFS. So it's a decentralized back end to this website, which basically makes it like unstoppable. So it's like sort of an unstoppable utility for sharing and storing information. That's a pretty powerful tool. The Holocaust Museum as well in Berlin is using Filecoin, I believe, which is important because you need to have a way to keep information secure and stored in perpetuity. That's something you never want to forget, quite literally. You never know if it's stored on a centralized system, that company gets bought by someone else, what happens to that server farm, what happens to that data, and so forth. So there's all these really interesting, obviously it all comes down to utility. You need to create systems that are more useful than what you had before, better user experience and so forth. But this is an example of that, where the decentralization, the unstoppability, so to speak, of these services is their value, right? And I think there are lots of other examples like this. Handshake, I think, is one that you've been looking at. You want to talk about that one a bit?
Yeah, Handshake's a really, really interesting project. Essentially what they're trying to do is create a decentralized DNS, or naming and certificate kind of authority. So the idea there is it can kind of create an alternative to the sort of existing naming systems and URL domains. The current system is highly centralized. I believe it's a couple single companies that are in control of essentially this extremely important sort of layer of the internet.
Yeah, I know. Everyone yesterday became, the 6-hour expert on DNS. It was like, let me tell you how the internet works. And
Yeah.
you learn about this crazy stuff.
Yeah, and there's this one company called VeriSign that owns that signed these like extremely favorable deals to essentially manage. I believe it's 13 or 15 of kind of these main naming systems, like .com, .net,
Yeah.
among a number of others, .gov. And so you kind of have to go through this one company in order to sort of get the URLs that you need, and it doesn't really make sense because the internet. This kind of goes back to what you were saying. The internet is this, at least the idea is to be this decentralized information network for anyone to access.
Yeah.
But when you look at the current stack, there's a number of different layers that are controlled by one, two, or maybe three players.
Which is crazy when you think about it.
Yeah, which is crazy. And it's the complete opposite of what the whole system is meant to be. I think another thing that's getting really, really interesting is this idea of the splinter net. And so what the splinter net is essentially this idea that the internet is becoming, essentially, people are seeing different versions of the internet now based on where they live. So it's like a geographically split internet. A good example of that would be like China.
Sure.
Obviously, when you're in China, a number of the websites and a number of the information is just completely different. And there's an argument to be made that the internet should be sort of it should be a globally accessible and almost globally equal network. It doesn't really make sense that geographical boundaries sort of change what you see on this resource. It also leads to kind of more polarization because people are quite literally seeing different kind of realities. And so if you can put all of this information on chain, and the nice thing about being on chain is that it's there for everyone to see, and it can't be sort of changed unless you sort of obviously 51% attack the network. Then you can create this sort of one version of reality, or at least a shared consensus of reality, versus the current sort of different realities that we're living in today.
So you have to wonder whether or not we're just going to end up in a siloed environment anyway, for political reasons more than anything else. I mean, we have a great firewall of China for the internet, and for a while crypto was available in China, and every year they try and tighten their grip further and further. And in the end, I think it's like trying to catch water; it runs through your fingers. But in the end, like the user experience for someone in China trying to access Web3, even if it's all running on Filecoin or whatever, is still going to be very different than it is for someone who's accessing it from Canada, because the reach of the state, the modern surveillance state like in China, is still pretty significant. So I think definitely a way to make it fairer and more resilient and more censorship resistant, but only there's always a point, right, at which I think, the threat of armed force is overwhelming. So we'll see about that. This is one of those things where I think people are probably listening to this podcast thinking like, I'm not really sure like how this affects my life. I'm not really sure how to get exposure to this, if I'm looking at it as an investor. Not that we're here to provide investment advice, but I know that some people think about that stuff. I guess the question is this sort of too early, right? Are we sort of too early to be thinking about, like, we think about this because it's our job, but is it too early for the average person to be thinking about this, or should they be paying attention to what's going on in Web3?
Yeah, I think everyone should be paying attention to Web3. I think, overall, crypto is sort of seen as the fastest growing subsector of tech. And obviously tech is the fastest, if not one of the fastest sort of sectors of the economy. And then within crypto, like maybe we're in kind of the, I don't know, top of the second inning when it comes to DeFi. But when it comes to Web3, we are still very much in the first inning. It's very, very early. And so I think it's an incredibly exciting area to pay attention to. It's also an area that I think is easier for the mainstream audience to grasp. everyone is pretty much at this point, everyone is a big user of social media websites and sort of understands the flaws inherent in a lot of these platforms. I mean, we got a great example of it yesterday when Facebook went down. And so I think everyone sort of naturally understands this a lot faster than they do with DeFi, where sort of it's obviously a little bit more math based. It's not everyone is sort of as involved in their personal finances.
Sure.
And so I think it has the potential to be as big, or if not bigger, than DeFi. And DeFi has essentially gone from less than $1 billion to $200 billion in total assets locked in 18 months. So if you think about it that way, like there's that level of type of growth potentially ahead for Web3, and it's still very, very early. So I think to me, it's an incredibly exciting area to be kind of involved in. It's not sort of, like I said, it's not in the same sort of adoption cycle as DeFi is. And so DeFi is something you can kind of, you can actually see the revenue, you can see the adoption. Web3 is still a little bit more theoretical.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I'm still very excited about sort of Web3, and I do spend a good amount of time sort of beyond DeFi and NFTs in sort of this Web3 area.
Well, you mentioned that the pie or the size of the market is at least as big, as DeFi, and I think that that's true. I mean, if you look at the valuation of the largest companies in the world today, 10, 15 years ago, it was a lot of industrials and financials and so forth. Today, it's basically all Web2 companies, or companies that are like very deeply connected to Web2. So it's Google, it's Amazon, it's Facebook, but also, Apple, Tencent, and others. To find the largest financial services firm on the list is number 10, JP Morgan. So a lot more value has actually been created through the Web2 model than through almost any other period in human history, right? And now we're talking about a new way to approach many of the problems that Web2 seeks to solve, and many of the kinds of products and services that it creates. And that obviously is like a very big economic pie. And, this is anecdotal, I don't have data on it, but it's pretty obvious now that the best people in tech are going to Web3 into crypto. And part of that, at least part of that, is an exodus from these Web2 companies, which frankly, if you're sitting on, if you're working for a company that has $1 trillion market capitalization and you get a stock option grant, there's only so much more that it can go, right? I guess it could be worth 2 or 3 trillion. We could definitely get there soon. But you're not going to see the kind of, era defining growth that we saw with the internet in the 90s and what we're seeing now in this space too. So I think that's obviously helping to accelerate it. As you got good people, you're going to make good companies and good projects, right? So
yeah,
that's definitely part of it.
Yeah, and one other thing I want to add too is the potential market cap for Web3, I actually think is way larger than the current sort of market cap or market size of Web2. And the reason why is because the sort of properties of how Web3 are structured make it an incredibly exciting and attractive platform for third-party developers to build integrations, build apps on top, build projects. A good example of this is Facebook. One of the big sort of one of the big problems with Web2 platforms is they have these very kind of closed source development platforms for other third-party application developers to build on. So this makes it really dangerous to build on top of existing Web2 platforms. The perfect example is Zynga and Farmville. So Zynga was this publicly traded company that was building essentially games on top of Facebook's API. And then one day, Facebook just turned off access to the API and essentially nuked the market cap of Zynga and these other sort of third-party application developers. So the beauty with Web3 is that because the underlying platforms are decentralized, there's no central operator that can sort of just cut off access on day one. And so that is going to it's going to create this incredible platform that's never been seen before, that can allow users to build these third-party applications And so I think the underlying size of Web3 could be a multiple of what Web2 is, the same way that Web2 was a multiple of Web1.
Yeah, I love that analogy. Yeah, I mean, these are walled gardens, whether it's, building like connecting Facebook's API or building in the Apple App Store. These are environments that are controlled by monopolies that can turn you on and off at a moment's notice and extract usurious fees from you in the case of the App Store, right? Where Apple's the biggest video game company in the world, and it doesn't produce any video games. It just extracts fees from Epic and others. It's crazy stuff like that. The other thing is that the internet, as we know it today, I just did some air quotes, but people who are listening can't see. There's no way to really capture the value. Like, what's the market capitalization of the internet itself, right? The thing that all these companies are built on top of. Hard to know. It's probably, if it were monetizable, if it was tokenized, it'd be trillions and trillions of dollars, right? Because of the utility it's created. And now we have a model to actually like own a piece of the internet, right? So it's almost a way to sort of expose the value of what the internet has been worth all along by putting some of the ownership in the hands of users. Boy, this is getting me really excited. It makes me want to like do something in Web3. Maybe Ninepoint will have to think of a way to get involved there. All right, that concludes today's episode of DeFi Decoded. This is such a cool subject. We're going to have to bring a Web3 person on to talk about this in detail. I think you and I have, done a decent job here of starting the conversation, but there's so much more to discuss. So thanks again, everyone. Andrew, pleasure as always. And we'll see you on the next episode of DeFi Decoded, where we'll be back with our special guest. Hopefully won't be out of date by then. Cheers, everyone. Bye.
The information contained herein does not constitute an offer or solicitation by anyone in the United States or in any other jurisdiction in which such an offer or solicitation is not authorized, or to any person to whom it is unlawful to make such an offer or solicitation. Prospective investors who are not residents in Canada should contact their financial advisor to determine whether securities of the funds may be lawfully sold in their jurisdiction.